I never imagined that something as ordinary as a small bouquet of wildflowers could completely change my life. At the time, I believed I had finally found the quiet I had been searching for. I had moved to a small town after spending years in a busy city where every day felt exactly the same. My work had become exhausting. My apartment had never truly felt like home, and after losing my mother 2 years earlier, I found myself feeling more alone than I had ever expected. People often say that time heals everything. I wanted to believe them, but grief has its own schedule. Some mornings, I woke up feeling almost normal. And then something as simple as seeing a woman buying the same tea my mother used to drink would bring everything rushing back. Moving away seemed like the only way to start over. The house I rented wasn't large. It was an older place with white wooden walls, a tiny porch, and a small garden that had clearly been cared for by someone who loved flowers. Lavender grew along the fence, roses climbed around the mailbox, and there was a little stone path leading to the front door. I instantly loved the peaceful atmosphere. The neighborhood was quiet. Most of the people had lived there for decades. They smiled when they passed each other, waved from their gardens, and always seemed to know everyone's name. I was different. I was the newcomer. For the first few weeks, I barely spoke to anyone. My days followed the same routine. I worked remotely from my dining table, took evening walks around the nearby lake, read books before bed, and slowly unpacked the boxes that still reminded me how recently I had moved. The silence didn't bother me. Actually, I thought I preferred it. Then one Friday morning, everything changed. When I opened my front door to take out the trash, I noticed a tiny bouquet of wildflowers lying neatly on the welcome mat. There was no note, no ribbon, no name, just freshly picked flowers. For a few seconds, I simply stared at them. I looked around the street, expecting to see someone walking away or laughing because they had left them at the wrong house. Nobody was there. The neighborhood was unusually calm. Only the sound of birds filled the air. I picked up the bouquet and brought it inside. The flowers were simple. Daisies, blue cornflowers, tiny yellow blossoms I couldn't even name. Someone had clearly gathered them with care. At first I assumed they belonged to another neighbor and had been delivered to the wrong address. That explanation made perfect sense. I left them in a glass of water anyway. They looked beautiful on my kitchen table. By the evening I had almost forgotten about them. The following Friday, I opened my door again. Another surprise was waiting. This time it was a small paper bag. Inside were several homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped carefully in wax paper. Again, no note, no explanation, no name. I smiled without realizing it. The mystery had become slightly amusing. Someone was obviously trying to be kind. Or perhaps someone had confused me with another neighbor once again. Still, I decided I should find out. That afternoon I asked the woman who owned the small grocery store across the street if anyone had mentioned leaving flowers or cookies for a new resident. She looked puzzled. She shook her head. Everyone knew everyone around here, she explained. And she hadn't heard anything unusual. Her answer only made me more curious. The next Friday I actually woke up earlier than usual. I made coffee and quietly sat near the front window, where I could see the porch without being noticed. I told myself I wasn't spying. I was simply solving a harmless mystery. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Around 8 in the morning I became distracted by a work meeting. It lasted less than 40 minutes. When I finally walked outside after the meeting, there it was, another gift. An old hardcover novel, one I had wanted to read for years, but had somehow never purchased. There wasn't even a price sticker on it. It looked carefully chosen. My heart began to race. How could someone know what books I liked? Then I laughed at myself. Of course they did, and single quotes. It had to be coincidence. It was simply a classic novel that many people enjoyed. Still, something about the situation no longer felt random. That evening I walked slowly around the neighborhood, not because I expected answers, mostly because I wanted to observe people. Children were riding bicycles. An elderly man watered tomatoes. A young couple painted their fence. Everything looked completely ordinary. Nothing suggested that someone was secretly leaving thoughtful presents at my door every Friday morning. Days continued passing. Work kept me busy. The gifts remained on my mind much more often than I wanted to admit. I even caught myself wondering what might appear next. It felt ridiculous. I was a grown woman becoming excited over anonymous surprises. The fourth Friday arrived. This time I opened the door almost nervously. A small ceramic flower pot stood on the mat. Inside grew fresh basil, Attached to it was a tiny wooden tag with only one handwritten word, for home. That was all. No signature. Just those two simple words. I read them over and over. For home. It was the first message I had received. Strangely, it didn't frighten me. Instead, it filled me with warmth I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Someone wanted this unfamiliar house to feel like home. I placed the basil beside the kitchen window. Every morning after that, I watered it before making breakfast. Soon the leaves became larger. Whenever I cooked, I used a little of it. Every meal reminded me of the mysterious stranger. I began paying closer attention to the people around me. There was one elderly woman who often sat on her porch reading thick books. She lived only 3 houses away. Sometimes she looked toward my garden with a gentle smile. Whenever our eyes met, she waved politely. Nothing more. She seemed kind, quiet, almost shy. I wondered if she had always lived there, but I quickly dismissed the thought. She looked like someone who respected other people's privacy far too much to secretly leave gifts. Another week passed. Friday came again. This time there was nothing outside. I felt strangely disappointed. The empty porch somehow looked colder than usual. I told myself the mystery was finally over. Maybe whoever had been doing it had moved away. Maybe they had realized they had the wrong address after all. Maybe I would never know. The thought surprised me, not because I desperately needed an answer, but because those little gifts had quietly become part of my week. They had given me something unexpected to look forward to, something that reminded me kindness still existed, even when nobody asked for recognition. Late that afternoon, there was a gentle knock on my door. When I opened it, the elderly woman from 3 houses away stood there holding an empty wicker basket. She smiled warmly. She seemed slightly nervous. She explained that she had been cleaning her attic and had found several heavy boxes of old family belongings. She wasn't as strong as she used to be, and wondered if I might help carry them downstairs someday. Of course I agreed. Helping her seemed like the least I could do. We arranged to meet the following morning. At the time, I had absolutely no idea that accepting such a simple request would uncover a story that had been waiting decades to be told. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sky was clear, and the neighborhood was still wrapped in the quiet calm I had come to love. I made myself a cup of coffee, watered the little basil plant on my kitchen windowsill, and walked the short distance to my neighbor's house. Her front garden was beautiful. It wasn't carefully designed or perfectly symmetrical, but every flower seemed to have been planted with love over many years. Roses climbed along an old wooden fence, lavender filled the air with a gentle scent, and small stone statues peeked out from between colorful blossoms. The house itself looked like it had been standing there forever. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed shelves filled with books, framed photographs, and handmade quilts. Everything felt warm and lived in, as though every object carried a memory. The attic was much larger than I expected. Dozens of old cardboard boxes were stacked neatly against the walls. Some were labeled with years, while others simply had handwritten words like letters, summer, or family. Dust floated through the sunlight that came in from a tiny window. As I carefully carried the first few boxes downstairs, I couldn't help wondering how many stories were hidden inside them. We worked quietly for almost an hour. I didn't mind the silence. Some people have a way of making silence feel comfortable instead of awkward. She was one of those people. Eventually, only a few boxes remained. One of them was noticeably heavier than the others. As I lifted it, the bottom corner gave way. Several old photo albums slid onto the wooden floor, loose photographs scattered everywhere. I immediately knelt down to collect them before they became bent or damaged. Most of the pictures were decades old. Children riding bicycles, family picnics, birthday cakes, graduations, ordinary moments that somehow seemed incredibly valuable. Then one photograph caught my attention. My hands froze. I stared at it for several long seconds, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. The young woman smiling at the camera looked exactly like my mother. Not similar, exactly like her. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, but there was no mistaking her smile. I had seen that smile my entire childhood. Standing beside her was the elderly neighbor, only much younger. They had their arms around each other and looked happier than almost anyone I had ever seen in a photograph. I slowly turned the picture over. Written neatly on the back were only 3 words: best friends forever. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I felt as though time had stopped. How was this possible? My mother had never mentioned this woman, not once. Growing up, I knew about cousins, old classmates, coworkers, and distant relatives, but never about a best friend. I carefully continued looking through the album. Page after page showed the same two young women at the beach, picking apples, celebrating birthdays, decorating a Christmas tree, laughing so hard that several photographs had captured nothing but blurred movement. It wasn't a casual friendship, they had shared years of their lives together. The realization left me speechless. How could someone so important disappear from every story my mother had ever told me? The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Although I kept helping organize the boxes, my thoughts never left those photographs. Back at home, I couldn't stop thinking about them. That evening I opened the box containing my own family keepsakes. It had traveled with me through 3 different apartments and 1 cross-country move. Inside were old birthday cards, school certificates, and dozens of family photographs. I searched carefully. Finally, tucked between 2 albums, I found another picture. My mother stood in front of a small lake. The same woman from next door stood beside her. The photograph had been folded years ago, making it difficult to notice at first. Again, they were smiling exactly the same way. As if nothing in the world could separate them. I turned it over. This time there was a date, almost 35 years earlier. No names. No explanation, just a date. The mystery that had begun with flowers had suddenly become much bigger. Over the next several days, I found myself noticing details I had ignored before. Whenever I walked past her house, she seemed to glance toward me with quiet kindness. Not curiosity, not pity, something much deeper, almost familiarity. One afternoon I visited the local library to learn more about the town's history. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I simply hoped that perhaps my mother had lived there longer than I realized. The librarian was incredibly helpful. She showed me old community newsletters, newspaper clippings, and photographs from local events decades earlier. I spent hours flipping through yellowed pages. Then I found another familiar face, a newspaper article about a charity garden festival. There they were, my mother and my neighbor, standing side by side while planting flowers for a community fundraiser. The article described them as volunteers who had organized neighborhood events for years, not months, not a single summer, years. The more I discovered, the more confused I became. Why had my mother erased this entire chapter of her life? I tried remembering every conversation we had ever shared. She often talked about school. She spoke about my grandparents. She even told funny stories about coworkers from jobs she had left decades earlier. But this woman, nothing, not even her name. That silence suddenly felt intentional. A few days later, I received another surprise. It wasn't Friday. When I opened my front door that morning, I found a small envelope. Inside was a pressed lavender flower. Nothing else. No writing. No explanation. The flower looked incredibly old. Its color had faded over the years, yet it had been preserved with remarkable care. I placed it carefully inside one of my books. Instead of feeling frustrated by the unanswered questions, I noticed something unexpected happening inside me. For the first time since losing my mother, I felt close to her again. Every photograph revealed another smile I had never seen, another memory I had never known existed, another version of the woman I thought I understood completely. Grief had always made me feel as though I was slowly forgetting her. Now, somehow, I was meeting her all over again. One rainy afternoon, while working near my living room window, I noticed my elderly neighbor struggling to carry grocery bags from her car. Without thinking, I hurried outside to help. As we walked toward her front door, I noticed a familiar scent. Lavender, the exact same fragrance that had filled every bouquet left on my porch. It lingered gently around her sweater. The realization wasn't proof of anything. Many people grew lavender. Many people wore floral perfume. Still, something inside me whispered that the pieces were finally beginning to fit together. Later that evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children laughed somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. The basil plant moved gently in the evening breeze. I looked at it for a long time. Then I suddenly remembered the handwritten tag, for home, not welcome, not enjoy, for home. Those words now carried an entirely different meaning. Whoever had left the gifts hadn't been trying to impress me. They had been trying to make sure I felt that I belonged here. That thought stayed with me long after darkness settled over the neighborhood. Deep inside, I was beginning to suspect that the answers I had been searching for were much closer than I had ever imagined. I simply wasn't prepared for the truth that would finally be waiting for me before the next Friday arrived. The following Thursday evening, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had discovered during the past week. The photographs, the newspaper article, the pressed lavender flower, and the strange feeling that every answer was somehow waiting just beyond my reach. I woke up early on Friday, for the first time since the mysterious gifts had begun appearing. I wasn't excited to see what might be waiting outside my door. Instead, I wanted the truth. When I opened the front door, there was no bouquet.no cookies.no book, only a small envelope resting neatly on the welcome mat. My name was written across the front in careful handwriting. Inside was a single photograph.it was another picture of my mother and the elderly neighbor. This one looked different from all the others. The edges were worn from being held many times. On the back was one handwritten sentence. Some promises are simply too important to forget. I held the photograph for several minutes before placing it carefully inside my bag. I knew where I needed to go. As I walked toward my neighbor's house, I realized how much my life had changed in only a few weeks. When I first arrived in this town, I had wanted nothing more than peace and distance from my past. Now I was walking directly toward memories I hadn't even known existed. She was already outside, sitting quietly in her garden, trimming dried lavender stems. The morning sunlight made the flowers glow with soft shades of purple. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she noticed the photograph in my hands. The gentle smile on her face slowly faded, her eyes filled with emotion, not dramatic sadness, but the quiet weight of memories carried for many years. Without saying a single word, she invited me to sit beside her. Silence surrounded us. For once, it didn't feel mysterious. It felt respectful. After several long minutes, she disappeared inside the house and returned, carrying a small wooden box. The wood had become smooth with age. Its brass clasp was slightly worn. She placed it carefully on the table between us. Inside were dozens of letters. Some were tied together with faded blue ribbon. Others had yellowed with time. There were birthday cards, holiday postcards, pressed flowers, ticket stubs, and tiny handwritten notes that had clearly been treasured for decades. Everything inside belonged to a friendship that had lasted much longer than I had ever imagined. As I gently looked through the collection, one truth became impossible to ignore. My mother had never forgotten this woman. She had simply chosen to protect something deeply personal. Near the bottom of the box rested a small journal. Most of its pages contained gardening notes, recipes, and ordinary daily memories. Then I found several pages that mentioned my mother. Reading them felt like discovering pieces of a family history that had been hidden in plain sight. Years earlier, my mother had become seriously ill, long before anyone else knew how quickly her health would decline. She had written to her closest friend. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for medical advice. She had made only one request: if anything ever happened to her, she hoped someone would quietly watch over her daughter if their paths ever crossed again. Not to replace her, not to interfere, simply to make sure I never felt completely alone. The words were simple. The promise was enormous. Suddenly, every mystery made sense. The flowers, the homemade cookies, the carefully chosen book, the basil plant, the tiny message that read, "For home." None of those gifts had been random. They had been acts of quiet kindness from someone honoring a promise made many years before. Tears filled my eyes, not because I felt heartbroken, because, for the first time since losing my mother, I realized that part of her love had continued reaching me long after she was gone. It had simply arrived through someone else's hands. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Every Saturday morning, I visited my neighbor. Sometimes we worked in the garden. Sometimes we sorted old photographs. Other times we simply drank tea while watching birds gather near the fence. We didn't need many words. The photographs told enough stories on their own. Little by little, I learned about the young woman my mother had once been. She had loved planting flowers. She had laughed loudly during thunderstorms because they reminded her of childhood summers. She had once driven 3 hours just to surprise her best friend on her birthday. She had dreamed of opening a tiny bookstore surrounded by flowers. There were countless stories I had never heard before. instead of making me sad. They helped me know her in a completely new way. One afternoon, we planted fresh lavender along the edge of my garden. The scent immediately reminded me of the very first bouquet left on my porch. As I looked across the small yard, I realized something remarkable. When I had moved into this house, it had simply been a place to live. Now it felt like home. Not because the walls had changed, because my heart had. Months passed, the seasons slowly shifted. The basil plant grew so large that I eventually moved it into a bigger pot. The roses bloomed brighter than ever. Neighbors, who had once been strangers, now stopped to wave whenever they passed. The quiet town no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt like the place where I belonged. One afternoon, while organizing my own shelves, I found the first bouquet pressed carefully between the pages of an old notebook. The flowers had faded. Their colors were softer now, but they remained beautiful. I smiled as I remembered how confused I had been that very first Friday morning. Back then, I thought someone had simply delivered flowers to the wrong house. I couldn't have been more mistaken. They had found exactly the right home. Looking back, I understand something I didn't know then. Love doesn't always disappear when the people we love leave this world. Sometimes it survives through promises, through memories, through ordinary acts of kindness that ask for nothing in return. Sometimes it waits patiently until we're finally ready to recognize it. I moved to this town, hoping to leave my past behind. Instead, I found a part of my mother's life that she had quietly carried in her heart until the very end. And through one unexpected friendship, I discovered that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes family is built by loyalty, compassion, and promises that remain unbroken across decades. Every Friday morning, I still place a small bouquet of wildflowers on my kitchen table, not because I expect another mystery, but because every bouquet reminds me that even the smallest gesture can change someone's life forever. If there's one lesson this journey gave me, it's that we rarely realize how deeply our kindness touches another person's life. A flower, a homemade cookie, a favorite book, a simple note. They may seem insignificant in the moment, yet years later, they can become the very reason someone believes they are not alone. And sometimes, that is the greatest gift anyone could ever receive.